Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about the AC-1 Sentinel. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and a subscription because that would massively help me out with the algorithm stuff. Now let's get going. In order to understand the history of the Sentinel, we need to go back to the First World War, where the Australian Imperial Force got a lot of experience working with tanks. This is because 3 significant battles were supported by British tanks. In the first battle of Bullecourt, 12 British tanks and the 1st Anzac Corps tried to attack the German defences. When the operation went ahead, several tanks broke down and the others went off course. The Australians lost about 3,200 men in the battle, suffering a massive defeat. So as you can imagine, this led to a lot of bitterness and distrust towards tanks. It took over a year for the Australians to re-attempt another attack including tanks, and this was, according to Peter Beale, superbly planned and executed, using infantry, tanks, artillery and aircraft to secure everything in half an hour. After several more attacks with tanks, the Australians were actually quite knowledgeable and enthusiastic about tanks, even though having no tanks of their own. Now we're going to do a little time skip to the year 1939, where Britain and France declared war on Germany after they attacked Poland. At the same time, the Crown colonies and the Dominions were called into the war, including Australia. When the war in Europe became dire, the first sketches of the Sentinel cruiser tank appeared. And even though industrial limitations repeatedly hampered with the production, the Sentinel entered limited production in the middle of 1942. Considering this was the very first tank ever made by the Australians, this is a good tank. Of course, the Sentinel still had its faults, but other countries also faced these faults when they started making tanks. One of the weaknesses was the cooling of the engine. The second one was the turret reverse mechanism was unbalanced. This is because the turret was made for a QF 6-pounder but eventually got the QF 2-pounder instead. And lastly, it had a very high rate of wear on the road wheel rubber. When production started in 1942, you could argue that the Sentinel was kind of outdated, but this is when you compare it to the Germans. The Germans by this time already started production for the Tiger 1 tank. So a QF 2-pounder is gonna do much against the 102mm of steel. But when you compare it to the bigger threat to Australia, the Japanese, you can clearly see that this tank is capable of holding its own. This is because the Japanese didn't have a lot of tanks, the tanks weren't armed with any strong main armaments, and they didn't have any reach. The first decent tank Japan produced, in my humble opinion, was the Chinook, which on paper was capable of going toe-to-toe with the earlier versions of the M4 Sherman. But this tank was only put into service in 1944 and it stayed on the Japanese islands Kyushu as a home defense measure. I would also like to say that the tanks Japan made were there to help infantry, so for example for recon purposes and mobility in jungles. This was because the Chinese didn't have any real armored vehicles of their own. Added to that, most of their resources went to their navy, not to the army, so making a lot of expensive tanks was out of the question even if they wanted to make them. The Sentinel didn't have a very long-lived production, it was only produced a mere 65 times, which isn't anywhere near enough for the estimated 700 needed to stop a Japanese invasion. But once the Americans gathered strength and forced the Japanese back, the likelihood of an Australian invasion shrunk. If you want a good tank, you need armor. Its armor thickness ranged from 65mm to 45mm, which for a light cruiser tank is sufficient. Of course, it would be useful to have more armor, but keep in mind that the Sentinel was intended to be a light cruiser tank. And when you compare it to the Crusader, the Sentinel seems to be very well armored. Of course, to propel a 28-ton tank forward you need a good engine. In this case it were multiple engines in the name of 3 V8 Cadillac engines, having a total horsepower of 330. And it had a horsepower to ton ratio of 12, and a top speed of 48 km an hour, and a range of 240 km. A cruiser generally has a smaller profile and this tank is not very big either. It was 6.3 meters long, almost 2.8 meters wide and 2.5 meters tall. This makes it in terms of stature very comparable to the Cromwell tank, which was also a cruiser. Sentinel was capable of housing 5 crew members in there, and these crew members were the commander, the gunner, the loader, the driver and the hull machine gunner. Because this tank didn't see any combat, it is kind of difficult to see all of its faults because most of the faults of the tank get exposed during intensive action. So I will base my opinion on the test results I've seen and heard about. Like I said before, the Sentinel was the first Australian tank ever made, so I'll take it a little easier with them in my criticism. The Sentinel was a good but not great tank. Its armor was decent for a cruiser of that time, and considering Japan would have had a very difficult time penetrating that, it is a good thing. Another good thing about its armor is that its entire hull was casted in a time where the British used welded and riveted plates. Its main armament on the other hand was poor. Its mobility was good, 48 km an hour theoretical top speed is fast, especially in a tank. And one advantage was that the Sentinel was small, so it would make spotting it harder. It would also make it easier to maneuver through jungles, and also hitting it was harder as well. It did have some issues with cooling, like I said before, but this was an issue which a lot of tanks faced during that time. Just overall looking at the tank, I'm honestly impressed by it. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as I see that 50% of you aren't subscribed yet. Turn that bell on notifications whenever I upload. I was also thinking of starting a historical gaming channel where I upload gaming videos now and then. These will be mainly about, well, historical games, and if you're interested in that, just let me know. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.